Reed Hastings just crashed Netflix stock 77%. 800,000 customers cancelled in 4 months. Employees were quitting. The media declared Netflix dead. Wall Street called it the dumbest decision in media history. 3 years later, Netflix is worth $500 billion. What did Hastings see that everyone else missed? September 2011. Hastings walks into Netflix headquarters knowing he's about to destroy his own company. Wall Street analysts are predicting record profits. The stock is at an all-time high. Netflix has crushed Blockbuster and dominates DVD rentals with 95% market share. And Hastings announces he's killing it all. 2 separate companies, 2 separate accounts, 2 separate bills. Customers are furious. Investors are panicking. Every business expert says this is suicide. But this wasn't reckless. This wasn't panic. This was the most calculated strategic decision in media history. And in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly how Hastings saw the future while everyone else was defending the present. Take yourself back to 2007. Netflix is printing money from DVD rentals. They mail 1.9 million discs per day. Revenue growing 20% annually. Profit margins are healthy. Life is good. Then streaming technology emerges, YouTube launches, Hulu appears. And every company in media sees the same threat. Streaming will cannibalize our profitable DVD business. Blockbuster's response? Ignore it. Double down on retail stores. Their perspective. People want new releases, and new releases aren't available for streaming. Streaming is niche technology for low-quality content. Hollywood's response? Fight it with lawsuits. Restrict content licensing. Their perspective? Streaming cannibalizes DVD sales and theatrical releases. Protect existing revenue at all costs. Cable companies see streaming as just another content channel they control. Their perspective? We own the pipes, we control distribution. We set the rules. Every major player applies identical perspective. Streaming threatens our current business model. Defend what we have. Reed Hastings looks at the same information and sees something completely different. But here's what nobody tells you. Hastings didn't have better information than Blockbuster. He didn't have insider knowledge Hollywood lacked. He didn't have a crystal ball cable companies couldn't access. He had a different framework for interpreting identical data. This is the perspective principle. 3 cognitive dimensions that reveal opportunities others miss. Temporal perspective, spatial perspective, and competitive perspective. Master these 3, and you see futures others can't imagine. Ignore them, and you defend yourself straight into bankruptcy. Netflix is worth $500 billion, while Blockbuster is a Harvard case study in failure. The difference wasn't resources. It wasn't luck. It was perspective. Temporal perspective is how you view time horizons. Most people see current state. Winners see trajectory. Here's the difference. In 2007, streaming quality was terrible. Buffering every 30 seconds. Low resolution. Limited content library. Most executives looked at current state and concluded, streaming isn't viable for premium content. Hastings looked at trajectory. Bandwidth is increasing 40% annually. Compression algorithms are improving. Consumer patience with physical media is declining. He didn't ask what is streaming today. He asked, what will streaming be in 2017? Current state thinking leads to incremental decisions. Trajectory thinking leads to transformation. Watch how this plays out. Blockbuster in 2007 saw DVD rentals are 96% of revenue. Streaming is 4%. Current state says protect the 96%. Logical. Safe. Wrong. Hastings saw streaming is growing 100% year over year. DVDs declining 10% annually. In 5 years, those lines don't just cross. They invert completely. Trajectory says invest everything in the growth curve, even if it destroys current profits. I think a lot of people would like to compare this to what currently AI does in productivity. That's temporal perspective, separating billion-dollar decisions from bankruptcy decisions. But temporal perspective alone gets you killed, without spatial perspective. Spatial perspective is how broadly you frame competitive reality. Blockbuster framed narrowly. We compete with other video rental stores. Netflix framed broadly. We compete with all entertainment for consumer time and attention. When you frame narrowly, you miss category-destroying threats. Blockbuster didn't lose to another rental store. They lost to a company that redefined what rental meant. By the time Blockbuster understood the broader competitive space, game over. Hastings applied maximum spatial framing. He didn't ask how do we beat other rental companies. He asked, how do we become the primary way humans experience entertainment globally? That's not category competition, that's category creation. And category creation only becomes visible through broad spatial perspective. This broader framing revealed opportunities narrow. Framing made invisible. If you're competing with all entertainment, original content makes strategic sense. If you're just renting videos, original content is financial suicide. Perspective determines what's strategically possible. The third dimension is competitive perspective. Most companies apply reactive competitive perspective. What are competitors doing? How do we respond? That keeps you permanently one step behind. Hastings applied proactive competitive perspective. What will customers demand in 10 years that doesn't exist today? And how do we build it before competitors realize it's necessary? When Netflix announced original content production in 2011, the industry thought they'd lost their minds. You're a distribution company, not a studio. You're competing with Hollywood. This will bankrupt you. $100 million for House of Cards Season 1. Netflix's entire annual profit was $226 million. They spent nearly half their yearly profit on one show. Wall Street went ballistic. Analysts downgraded the stock. Articles predicted bankruptcy within 3 years. But look at it through Hastings' proactive perspective. In 10 years, all content is streaming. The companies that control content have pricing power. The companies that only distribute become commodities, fighting price wars. House of Cards wasn't just a show. It was proof Netflix could create premium content. It attracted subscribers who'd never joined for library content. It gave Netflix negotiating leverage with studios who thought they controlled all premium content. It created the blueprint for becoming a media company, not just a delivery service. This is what perspective does. Same information, opposite conclusions. Same market conditions. Completely different strategic choices. Now watch what happens when perspective meets maximum pressure. September 2011. Hastings announces the split. DVD rental becomes Quickster. Streaming remains Netflix. Separate accounts, separate billing. Separate everything. Price increases 60% for customers who want both. The reaction is immediate and devastating. 800,000 customers cancel within 3 months. That's 8% of the entire subscriber base. Gone. Stock price collapses from $298 to $53 in 4 months. A 77% crash. Investors are panicking. Employees are updating LinkedIn. The media is writing Netflix's obituary in real time. Here's a September 2011 headline. Netflix, an extraordinary story of suicide. Another, how Netflix alienated its customer base and committed corporate suicide. Every business publication predicts bankruptcy within 18 months. But here's what Wall Street completely missed. Hastings wasn't trying to maximize customer satisfaction. He was trying to force a perspective shift in how customers, employees, and investors understood Netflix's future. The DVD business required completely different infrastructure than streaming. Massive warehouses full of physical discs, shipping logistics across the country, inventory management for millions of DVDs. The streaming business required technology infrastructure, content licensing deals, bandwidth optimization, recommendation algorithms. Running both under one brand created what Hastings called strategic confusion. Employees didn't know which business to optimize. Should we buy more DVDs or license more streaming content? Should we build better shipping logistics or better streaming technology? Customers didn't understand which service they were actually using. Investors couldn't value the company because growth and decline were mixed together in one number. The Quickster split had one purpose: make it crystal clear that Netflix is a streaming company. DVD rental is legacy business. We'll manage for cash flow, but our entire future is streaming. The execution was catastrophic. The communication was worse, but the underlying perspective was absolutely correct. Most CEOs protect short-term metrics at any cost. Hastings deliberately destroyed short-term metrics to establish correct long-term positioning. That's perspective under maximum pressure. Here's what nobody understood at the time. Hastings was willing to sacrifice 800,000 customers and 77% of stock value to establish the right strategic perspective in the market's mind. Within 3 months, he admitted the Quickster execution was a disaster. He apologized publicly. He kept services under one brand, but maintained separate pricing. The execution changed. The perspective remained constant. Netflix is a streaming company that happens to still rent DVDs, not a DVD company experimenting with streaming. Watch what happens next. By 2013, streaming subscribers surpassed DVD subscribers for the first time. By 2015, streaming is 75% of revenue. By 2020, the DVD business is essentially irrelevant, managed by a skeleton crew for the few remaining customers. The perspective that looked insane in 2011 became completely obvious by 2015, but Hastings saw it in 2007. That 8-year gap between seeing the future and the future arriving is where perspective creates competitive advantage. Here's the pattern most people miss. The same perspective framework guided every major Netflix decision. Original content? Perspective. We need content ownership for long-term pricing power. Global expansion? Perspective. Streaming has no geographic boundaries. We need global scale immediately. Binge release model? Perspective. Consumers want control over pacing, not network scheduling. Algorithm-driven recommendations? Perspective. Personalization creates retention better than any amount of mass-market content. Every decision that seemed risky or insane made perfect sense through the perspective framework. The framework stayed consistent. Execution sometimes failed. But course corrections maintained strategic perspective even when tactics changed. That consistency is what built a $500 billion company. Now here's something most business analysis completely ignores. Why did Hastings' perspective framework work when similar visionary bets destroyed other companies? The answer involves cognitive personality and how different minds apply identical frameworks differently. Reed Hastings is an INTJ on the Myers-Briggs type indicator. For those unfamiliar, this personality type is characterized by dominant introverted intuition and auxiliary extroverted thinking. What does this actually mean for business strategy? INTJs naturally see patterns and future trajectories. They're not focused on current state. They're obsessed with where systems are evolving. This is why Hastings could look at terrible 2007 streaming quality and see inevitable 2017 streaming dominance. His cognitive wiring naturally applies temporal perspective, but here's what's critical to understand. Personality type isn't destiny, it's tendency. Hastings consciously developed spatial and competitive perspective through systematic analysis, even though they weren't his natural cognitive strengths. He forced himself to map broader competitive contexts. He trained himself to think proactively rather than reactively. Compare this to Elon Musk from our previous video. Musk tests as INTJ or ENTP, depending on assessment timing. Both types share intuitive pattern recognition, but they apply it through different lenses. Musk's perspective framework emphasizes first principles thinking, break problems to fundamental truths, and rebuild from scratch. Hastings' perspective framework emphasizes trend extrapolation, identify trajectories and position ahead of the curve. Same cognitive tools, different application patterns, both insanely effective. This is why the purpose principle and perspective principle work together, but feel different in execution. Musk's purpose-driven decisions ask, what should exist for humanity's benefit? Hastings' perspective-driven decisions ask, what will exist based on current trajectories, and how do I position to capture that future first? Neither approach is superior. They're complementary methods for seeing opportunities others miss. And here's what matters for you. You can develop these perspective skills regardless of your natural personality type. I'm not naturally a long-term thinker. My default wiring is tactical, short-term problem solving, but I've trained myself to ask temporal perspective questions systematically. Where is this trend heading in 5 years? What seems impossible today that will be obvious in 10 years? What trajectory am I ignoring because current state looks stable? The perspective framework becomes exponentially more powerful when you recognize your natural cognitive biases and systematically counteract them. If you default to short-term thinking, force yourself to write long-term scenario analyses. If you default to narrow competitive framing, force yourself to map broader market contexts. If you default to reactive positioning, force yourself to imagine future customer demands before they exist. Back to Netflix's breakthrough moment. By 2013, the perspective-driven bets start paying off massively. House of Cards wins Emmy Awards, legitimizing Netflix as a content creator, not just a distributor. Streaming subscribers growing 25% annually. Original content creating differentiation competitors can't match because they're still licensing rather than owning. But the real breakthrough comes in 2016. Netflix goes fully global, launching in 130 countries simultaneously in a single day. This decision only makes sense through the perspective framework. Traditional media expansion was sequential. Master the US market, then expand to UK, then major European markets, one country at a time over a decade. Test, learn, optimize, expand. Safe, logical, slow. Netflix perspective. Streaming has no geographic constraints. Local competitors will emerge in every market within 5 years. We need global scale immediately to leverage content costs across maximum subscribers before regional players establish dominance. Spending $6 billion annually on content makes no economic sense for 50 million US subscribers. It makes perfect sense for 250 million global subscribers spreading costs across massive scale. The perspective framework made global expansion urgent rather than gradual, and that urgency created competitive moats before competitors even understood the game being played. By 2024, Netflix has 270 million subscribers across 190 countries. The company is worth $500 billion. More than Disney, more than Comcast, more than all traditional media companies combined that thought streaming was a threat to defend against rather than a future to dominate. The perspective framework worked Because it was based on trajectory analysis, not current state defense. And that's the pattern separating transformational companies from incremental ones. Now let me show you what happens when companies lack perspective frameworks. The contrast reveals why this principle is so devastatingly powerful. Blockbuster had every advantage Netflix didn't. Brand recognition across America, 9,000 physical locations, established customer relationships, 84 million active customers. In 2000, Blockbuster's revenue was $5 billion. Netflix was a tiny startup with 300,000 subscribers barely surviving. Blockbuster even had the opportunity to buy Netflix for $50 million in 2000. Reed Hastings flew to Dallas, pitched the acquisition, and Blockbuster CEO John Antioco laughed him out of the meeting. $50 million was too expensive for a company that mailed DVDs. Why did Blockbuster fail? Not because they didn't see streaming coming. They launched their own streaming service in 2004, 4 years before Netflix streaming became significant. They saw identical trends. They had vastly better resources. What they lacked was perspective framework. Blockbuster's perspective: streaming is an additional revenue channel that supplements our core retail business. Protect the stores at all costs. Add streaming as a convenience feature for existing customers. This defensive perspective led to defensive decisions. They limited streaming content to avoid cannibalizing retail traffic. They required retail customers to use streaming, but didn't let streaming-only customers avoid stores. They optimized for protecting existing revenue rather than capturing future revenue. When your perspective is defensive, every innovation becomes a threat to manage rather than an opportunity to dominate. Here's another example that proves the pattern. Kodak invented the digital camera in 1975. They had the technology, they had the patents, they had dominant market position. They went bankrupt in 2012 while digital photography became a $1 trillion industry. Why? Perspective failure. Kodak's perspective: digital cameras threaten our profitable film business. Their billion-dollar film revenue created a perspective that made digital cameras look dangerous rather than transformational. Protect film, slow down digital. Manage the transition to preserve current profits. Compare this to Netflix deliberately cannibalizing their own profitable DVD business to build streaming dominance. Same strategic choice, opposite perspectives, completely different outcomes. Kodak defended film revenue and lost everything. Netflix destroyed DVD revenue and built $500 billion in market value. Or look at taxi companies versus Uber. Every taxi company in every city could see smartphone adoption accelerating, GPS technology becoming standard, payment processing going digital, same information, zero strategic action. Why? Their perspective. We're a transportation company regulated by medallion systems. Those regulations are permanent fixtures we operate within. Uber's perspective. We're a technology platform connecting supply and demand. Regulations are temporary obstacles to route around with better customer experience and lower prices. One perspective saw regulation as fixed constraints. The other saw regulation as temporary barrier. Same reality, opposite strategic choices. Perspective determines what you see as possible. What you see as possible determines what you attempt. What you attempt determines what you achieve. Most business failures aren't execution failures, they're perspective failures. Companies work incredibly hard executing strategies doomed from the start because the underlying perspective framework is wrong. Here's the diagnostic test for perspective failure. When you describe threats to your business, listen to your language. Do you frame them as things to defend against or things to lead? Defensive language reveals defensive perspective. Offensive language reveals opportunity perspective. Blockbuster. How do we defend our stores against streaming competition? Netflix. How do we use streaming to dominate all entertainment globally? Same technology trend, opposite perspectives, completely different strategic trajectories. So how do you apply the perspective principle to see opportunities competitors are missing right now? Step-by-step framework. Step 1. Develop temporal perspective through trajectory analysis. Stop asking what is current state. Start asking where is this heading. Here's the exercise. Pick any trend in your industry. Write down current state with specific numbers. Then write down year-over-year growth rate. Now extrapolate 5 years forward, assuming that growth rate continues or accelerates. Most people skip this exercise because they think they already know the answer. But writing forces clarity you don't have when it's just vague intuition. When Netflix did this exercise in 2007, they wrote streaming is 2% of viewing, time growing at 200% annually. Broadcast TV is 98% of viewing time declining at 5% annually. In 5 years, those lines don't just cross, they completely invert. Streaming becomes dominant, broadcast becomes legacy. Current state said broadcast TV dominates for decades. Trajectory said streaming dominates within 5 years. Which perspective should guide 10-year strategy? Trajectory wins every time. Step 2. Expand spatial perspective through competitive context mapping. Stop asking, who are my direct competitors? Start asking what alternatives exist for the core value I provide to customers. Hastings didn't just map other video rental companies. He mapped all forms of evening entertainment: broadcast TV, cable TV, movie theatres, video games, sporting events, YouTube, social media, anything competing for leisure time between 7 p.m. and 11 p.m. This broader mapping revealed opportunities narrower framing made invisible. If you're competing with broadcast TV, then series content makes strategic sense. If you're just competing with Blockbuster, then movie library makes sense. Your competitive context determines your strategic options. Broader context reveals exponentially more options. Step 3. Apply proactive competitive perspective by asking what will customers want 5 years from now that doesn't exist yet. Most companies apply reactive perspective. What are competitors doing? How do we respond faster? This keeps you permanently one step behind market leaders. Netflix asked proactively, if customers could design their perfect entertainment experience with no constraints, what would they want? The answer? Unlimited content, zero commercials, watch anything, anytime, anywhere, personalized recommendations, no waiting for weekly episodes. None of this existed in 2007. All of it exists now because Netflix built it based on future customer desire rather than current customer requests. Here's the critical insight. Customers can't request what they can't imagine. Henry Ford's famous quote, "If I asked customers what they wanted, they'd say faster horses." Proactive perspective means seeing what customers will demand before they know they want it. Step 4. Test your perspective by writing the opposite argument. This catches blind spots before they kill you. For every major strategic choice, write 2 documents. Document A, why this decision is brilliant, based on my perspective framework. Document B, why this decision is terrible, based on opposite perspective. When Hastings considered original content production, he wrote both. Document A, content ownership creates long-term pricing power and competitive differentiation. Document B, content production diverts capital from core distribution competency and creates existential risk if content fails. Both documents were valid within their perspective frameworks. Writing both forced him to address Document B concerns within the strategy. That's how you stress test perspectives before betting the company. Step 5, practice perspective shifting by asking, how would different stakeholders view this identical situation? Take any business decision. Write how customers see it, how competitors see it, how suppliers see it, how employees see it, how investors see it. Same facts, 5 different perspectives, 5 different strategic conclusions. This reveals opportunities and risks. Single perspective analysis misses completely. Maybe customers love something employees hate. That's critical information for implementation planning. The perspective framework isn't about being smarter than competitors. It's about seeing more dimensions of identical reality. More dimensions means more strategic options. More options means better decisions under uncertainty. Here's what I want you to do right now. Think about the biggest strategic decision facing your business or career. Write it down. Don't just think about it. Write it. Now write 3 perspective analyses. First, temporal perspective. If current trends continue, where does this lead in 5 years? Second, spatial perspective. Who else competes for the same customer value in adjacent or distant markets? Third, competitive perspective. What will customers demand in the future that doesn't exist today? Most people skip this exercise. They think they already understand their situation, but writing forces clarity that vague intuition never provides. And that clarity reveals blind spots containing both catastrophic risks and extraordinary opportunities you're currently missing. Because here's what nobody talks about in business education. Perspective isn't natural talent. It's systematic practice applied consistently over time. Hastings wasn't born seeing streaming dominance while Blockbuster defended retail. He developed frameworks for analysing trends that revealed what defensive perspectives made invisible. You can develop identical capability. It requires discipline, not genius. Write temporal trajectories. Map competitive context broadly. Imagine future customer desires. Do this systematically for every major decision, and you'll start seeing opportunities that seem obvious in retrospect, but completely invisible before rigorous analysis. But there's something even more powerful than the perspective principle operating alone. In our next video, we're diving into the planning framework, how Jeff Bezos built Amazon's 20-year domination blueprint while competitors focused on quarterly earnings reports. Here's what actually happened. In 1997, Amazon was losing money on every single book sold. Investors were demanding immediate profitability. Bezos wrote a shareholder letter that became legendary. We will continue investing in long-term market leadership rather than short-term. Profitability for the foreseeable future. We're breaking down exactly how Bezos thought about time horizons, resource allocation, and multi-level planning. How he made investments that looked insane short-term but created insurmountable competitive advantages long term. Drop a comment with your perspective shift. Take that strategic decision you wrote down. What looks different when you apply temporal, spatial, and competitive perspective rigorously? What opportunity are you seeing now that you completely missed before this framework? I will read every comment and respond to everyone. More importantly, writing your perspective shift makes it actionable. It moves from abstract concept to concrete strategy you can execute. Hit subscribe and notification bell because we're building the Complete Success Framework series. 16 frameworks total. Purpose gave you direction. Perspective showed you opportunities others miss. Planning gives you the systematic roadmap to capture those opportunities before competitors even see them. And here's what's critical to understand. These frameworks compound. Purpose without perspective is conviction without market insight. Perspective without planning is vision without execution capability. You need all three operating together. We're only 2 videos into 16 frameworks. The entrepreneurs who master all 16 principles don't just build successful businesses, they build empires that transform entire industries and create hundreds of billions in value. See you in the next video. And remember this, perspective isn't about being smarter than competitors. It's about seeing more dimensions of the same reality everyone can see. More dimensions means more strategic options. More options means better decisions. Better decisions compound into dominance over time. What perspective shift did this video create for you? Tell me in the comments.